Night of blood and betrayal. How does a wife spend 7 hours beside her husband's lifeless, mutilated body without noticing a thing? How can a man, young and healthy, with no apparent enemies, meet such a horrific end in his own home? These are the questions that haunted a quiet village in Tanang County on a cold December morning. At 9 a.m., the tranquility of the countryside was abruptly shattered by an urgent call to the local police. An elderly man, his voice trembling with fear, reported a scene of unimaginable horror. His son-in-law, Wang Shuang, had been murdered during the night. The police raced to the scene, where they were met with a sight so grotesque that even the most experienced officers struggled to maintain their composure. On the bed lay Wang Shuang's lifeless body, his abdomen slashed to ribbons, his torso bearing wounds so savage that not a single intact patch of skin remained. The air in the modest home was thick with the metallic stench of blood, a smell that clung to the walls and seeped into every corner. Yet what truly unsettled the investigators wasn't solely the brutality of the crime. It was Leon, the wife. She claimed to have slept beside her husband throughout the night, insisting she had noticed nothing amiss. How could such a violent and gruesome murder unfold mere inches away without waking her? Was her shock genuine, or was she hiding a more sinister truth? These unsettling questions cast a shadow over the investigation and set the stage for a chilling search for answers. Answers that would reveal secrets far more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. The murder scene. When the police entered the bedroom, it was as if they had stepped into a living nightmare. The room was heavy with an oppressive silence, the kind that lingers long after violence has taken its toll. The first thing they noticed was the smell. A thick metallic stench of blood that clung to the air, mingling with the faint acrid scent of burnt fabric wafting from the fireplace. Wang Shuang's body lay grotesquely twisted on the bed, his abdomen carved open with a frenzy that spoke of unrelenting rage. The wounds were not merely fatal, they were a grim statement. Blood had soaked into the mattress, spreading outward in irregular dark stains, while the walls bore splashes of crimson, frozen mid-drip. The brutality of the attack seemed almost ritualistic, as if the killer had poured every ounce of hatred into each violent strike. The forensic team worked in somber efficiency, documenting the grisly scene with meticulous precision. Cameras flashed, capturing every grotesque detail, while gloved technicians examined the body. The jagged edges of the stab wounds suggested the blade had been used with both force and intent, as if the attacker knew exactly where to strike. The slashes on his abdomen, inflicted after death, hinted at a personal, almost vindictive fury, a need not just to end a life, but to desecrate it. Despite the horror before them, the investigators noticed something peculiar. There was no sign of forced entry. The doors were intact, the locks unbroken, and there were no shattered windows or disturbed footprints in the soft dirt outside. Whoever had committed this crime was either already inside the house or had been granted easy access. Leon stood nearby, her face pale, her hollow eyes fixed on nothing. Her expression suggested shock, but her body betrayed a subtle, uneasy tension. She claimed she had slept beside her husband all night, discovering his mutilated body only at dawn. But the evidence told a far different story. Forensic experts estimated that Wang Shuang had died around 1 a.m., 7 hours before Leon alerted anyone to his death, 7 long hours during which she lay beside a corpse mutilated with almost inhuman savagery. The timeline simply didn't match her account, and her unsettling calm only deepened the detectives' suspicions. The sheer brutality of the crime raised deeply troubling questions. How could Leon have slept through such a violent and prolonged attack? The force needed to inflict those wounds would have caused loud, unmistakable sounds. The screams of the victim, the sharp thud of a knife striking flesh, the shifting of the bed under the weight of the struggle. The investigators couldn't ignore the overpowering metallic tang of blood that now saturated the room, as though it had soaked into the very walls. How could she have failed to notice it? As they scoured the room for answers, another chilling discovery came to light. Wang Shuang's clothes and socks, the items he had been wearing before his death, were missing. When investigators examined the fireplace in the adjacent room, they found the ashes of fabric fibers. Further analysis confirmed that the fibers matched Wang Shuang's clothing. Someone had deliberately burned the evidence in an attempt to erase any trace of the crime. All eyes turned to Leon, Her trembling hands, her evasive gaze, and her overly controlled demeanor, everything about her raised suspicions. Was she truly a grieving widow paralyzed by shock? Or was she concealing a darker truth behind a carefully maintained facade? The contrast between the calculated, almost clinical savagery of the murder and Leon's implausible ignorance created a cloud of doubt around her every word. The investigators were certain of one thing. They had uncovered a crime rooted in something far deeper than blind rage, a widow's confession. As suspicions grew, the police braced for a lengthy investigation. Then, unexpectedly, Leon walked into the station, her face expressionless, her steps deliberate. "I did it," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I killed him." Her confession sent shockwaves through the room. The officers, who had been considering theories of intruders or hired killers, now faced the chilling truth. The murderer had been inside the home all along. Leon recounted the murder with unsettling clarity. She described how, in the dead of night, she slipped out of bed, clutching a kitchen knife. Standing over her sleeping husband, she plunged the blade into his abdomen with calculated force. As his body twitched and his eyes opened in shock, she muffled his cries with a sock. What followed was a frenzy of violence. She stabbed and slashed relentlessly, turning the bed into a blood-soaked scene of horror. Blood spattered the walls and seeped into the mattress, evidence of her unrelenting rage. After ensuring Wang Shuang was dead, Leon retrieved a utility knife and began carving deliberate slashes across his torso. "I wanted him to feel what he had made me feel," she said, her voice steady and devoid of remorse. Her confession raised more questions than it answered. How could a wife, once deeply in love, commit such a brutal act? Was this a sudden outburst of rage, or the result of years of brewing resentment? The police weren't convinced by her account. Was she truly acting alone, or was someone else involved? And what had driven her to cross the line into such unimaginable savagery? These questions loomed as the investigation pressed on. Secrets beneath the surface. Leon's confession was only the beginning. The police were determined to uncover the full story, a puzzle pieced together with betrayal, blood, and unrelenting rage. If Leon had killed her husband, what had driven her to such an extreme? What darkness lay beneath the surface of her seemingly ordinary life? The investigation turned to Leon's past and her relationship with Wang Shuang. What emerged was far from the love story their neighbors had imagined. 8 years earlier, Leon had been a bright-eyed 19-year-old, full of ambition and hope. She left her small hometown to work in Taiwan, determined to support her struggling family. Moving to a bustling industrial city was daunting, but Leon faced it with quiet resilience. It was in Taiwan's industrial zones that she met Wang Shuang. He was also far from home, a confident young man with sharp features and a warm smile. They bonded over shared struggles, working grueling hours to make ends meet. What started as casual conversations after long shifts grew into a connection neither had expected. Wang Shuang was charismatic, attentive, and optimistic about the future. He spoke often of his dreams, saving enough money to build a home in their village and starting a family. Leon, captivated by his vision, found herself falling in love. Their relationship thrived despite their challenges. They shared meals of cheap street food, whispered plans for the future during stolen moments, and found joy in small victories. For Leon, those early days felt like a foundation for a life of shared purpose. After 4 years of dating, they decided to marry. The wedding was simple. There were no grand gestures or lavish expenses, but it was filled with happiness. For Leon, it was everything she had ever wanted. She believed she had found a partner who would shield her from the hardships of life. But promises, as Leon would soon learn, are fragile things. Not long after their marriage, Leon gave birth to a son. She stayed home to care for the child, while Wang Shuang returned to Taiwan for work. At first, Leon believed his absence was a necessary sacrifice for their future. Each time he returned, she greeted him with warmth, eager to share the milestones their son had reached. Over time, however, Wang Shuang's visits grew infrequent and cold. The man who had once spoken of building a home together now seemed distant. His warm smiles were replaced with curt words and empty stares. Even the money he sent home began to dwindle, forcing Leon to stretch every coin to keep the household afloat. Then came the whispers. Friends and neighbors hinted at Wang Shuang's extravagant lifestyle in Taiwan. a luxury car, late-night parties, and dinners at upscale restaurants. Leon dismissed these rumors at first, convincing herself that her husband's distance was the result of work stress, but the signs were impossible to ignore for long. There were lipstick stains on his lips when he came home late one evening. His shirt carried the faint scent of a floral perfume she didn't recognize. Leon, desperate to believe in the man she loved, ignored these signs, holding on to the hope that they were innocent mistakes. The truth hit her with crushing finality one day when she found an ultrasound report tucked into his jacket pocket. The name on the report wasn't hers, but it confirmed that another woman was 2 months pregnant with Wang Shuang's child. The discovery shattered Leon. It wasn't just a betrayal of love, it was a betrayal of everything she had sacrificed. She had given up her dreams, her youth, and her happiness to build a family with him, only to be replaced by someone else. When Leon confronted him, Wang Shuang offered no denials. Instead, he delivered a cold, dismissive response that cut deeper than any blade. "You've failed to keep me happy," he said. Divorce, he declared, was the only way forward. He promised her a house and a car to soften the blow, but Leon knew they were empty words. His cruelty didn't stop there. As Leon's desperation grew, so did Wang Shuang's indifference. He mocked her, dismissed her pain, and belittled her efforts. During one heated argument, he grabbed a utility knife and slashed her wrist, leaving her bleeding and terrified. But the final straw came when Wang Shuang issued a chilling threat. If Leon didn't agree to the divorce, he vowed to destroy her life and her family's. Her elderly parents, who had stood by her through every storm, were now at risk of becoming collateral damage. Trapped in a pit of fear, rage, and hopelessness, Leon began to unravel. Her dreams of reconciliation turned into dark fantasies of escape. As days turned to weeks, those fantasies evolved into something darker: revenge. The thought grew like a seed in her mind, feeding on her pain and betrayal. Wang Shuang, who had once been the center of her world, now became a symbol of everything she had lost. Her anger festered, twisting her grief into something dangerous. What began as despair morphed into something unrecognizable. Leon, a woman who had once loved deeply, found herself standing on the edge of an abyss, and when the moment came, she would not hesitate to cross it. The breaking point. That night, Leon lay in bed beside Wang Shuang, her heart hammering in her chest. The man who had once been her source of comfort now felt like a suffocating weight pressing down on her. Every breath he took was a reminder of the lies, the betrayal, and the years of humiliation she had endured in silence. The love they had once shared had turned to ash, leaving behind only the torment of broken promises and stolen dreams. She closed her eyes, but sleep refused to come. The memories played on an endless loop: his cruel words, his dismissive glances, the way he had torn her dignity apart piece by piece. The ultrasound report she had found in his jacket pocket burned in her mind, a cruel reminder that another woman carried his child while she was left abandoned in their failing home. As the hours passed, her thoughts grew darker. She imagined a life without him, a life free from his cruelty, his threats, his smug indifference. For so long she had suppressed her pain, burying it deep beneath the weight of duty and endurance. But now it surged to the surface, rising like an unstoppable storm of hatred. She turned her head to look at Wang Shuang, his face peaceful in sleep, as if he had not a single worry in the world, as if the pain he had caused her did not exist. A fresh wave of rage tore through her. He had spent years treating her as if she were nothing, a mere inconvenience in his life, a woman he could discard when she no longer served his purpose, and now she would return the favor. At around 1 a.m., Leon quietly slipped out of bed, her movements deliberate, her mind racing with thoughts she could no longer ignore. The dim glow from the streetlights outside cast shifting shadows on the walls as she moved toward the small kitchen. Her fingers closed around the cold handle of the knife she had placed there earlier that evening, as if some part of her had already decided what would happen long before she consciously acknowledged it. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. It was something else, an overwhelming flood of emotion she had kept buried for years. The weight of every insult, every betrayal, every moment of helplessness now pressed into her palms as she gripped the blade. She returned to the bedroom and stood over Wang Shuang, staring down at the man who had once promised to stand by her, to love and protect her. That man no longer existed. if he ever had. In that moment, there was no hesitation, no regret, no second-guessing. The first stab was deliberate, the blade sinking deep into his abdomen. Wang Shuang jolted awake, his eyes wide with shock and pain. His body convulsed, but before he could scream, Leon shoved a sock into his mouth, silencing him. His muffled cries were the only sounds in the room as she drove the blade into him again and again. Her rage consumed her, fueling every violent strike. Each stab was a release of the years of loneliness, the endless humiliation, the nights spent crying herself to sleep while he lived freely, untouched by the pain he had caused. Blood sprayed onto the walls, onto her hands, soaking into the sheets, staining everything in the raw, violent color of her fury. But it wasn't enough. The knife in her hand felt like an extension of her anger, a tool to finally carve into the man who had carved away at her soul for years. She reached for the utility knife on the bedside table, its sharp blade catching the dim light, and began carving deep, deliberate slashes across his abdomen. This wasn't just an act of murder. It was an eruption of every suppressed emotion, every wound he had inflicted, every dream he had shattered. It was a reckoning. By the time she stopped, Wang Shuang's body was unrecognizable, a grotesque testament to the wrath that had consumed her. His once proud face was frozen in a final expression of horror, his body reduced to a lifeless, bloodied form. The room, once a place of shared intimacy, had become an unholy altar to her suffering. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was her own ragged breathing, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion, her arms weak from the force of her attack. The knife slipped from her fingers, landing on the floor with a dull thud. Her hands, slick with blood, trembled at her sides. She stared at what she had done, her mind unable to fully process the horror of it. The man who had caused her so much pain was gone, but with him, so was everything else, the life she had once known, the woman she had once been. She had destroyed it all in a single night of blind, unrelenting rage. And now, there was no turning back. The investigation unravels. By dawn, Leon's initial fury had settled into a chilling calm. She moved with eerie precision, washing away the blood and preparing to face what she knew was inevitable. At 9 a.m., Wang Shuang's body lay cold and mutilated on the blood-soaked bed as Leon called her father. Her voice was calm, but a faint tremor betrayed the hysteria she was suppressing. "He's dead," she said simply. Her father, horrified, contacted the police. When officers arrived, they were met with a scene of unimaginable brutality. The metallic stench of blood was so overpowering that some instinctively covered their noses. The mattress was saturated in red, sunken where the blood had pooled, while Wang Shuang's body bore countless stab wounds across his abdomen and torso. The deep, deliberate slashes carved into his flesh spoke of rage so profound it seemed unrelenting even after death. This was no accident or random act of violence. The scene made one thing abundantly clear: this crime was personal. The investigators' first steps. The detectives moved carefully, their trained eyes scanning the room for anything that might reveal the truth behind the gruesome scene. Leon's story quickly raised doubts. She claimed to have slept through the night and discovered Wang Shuang's body in the morning, but the brutality of the attack made that hard to believe. The room was a chaos of violence. Blood spattered the walls, the bed frame tilted slightly from the force of the struggle. How could she have missed the sounds of such carnage? Their first significant clue came from the fireplace in the living room. Among the ashes, they found charred fragments of fabric. Forensic experts carefully sifted through the remains, identifying fibers that matched Wang Shuang's missing clothes and socks. Someone had burned the evidence in a deliberate effort to hide their crime. The blood splatter patterns revealed even more chilling details. They showed that the attack had been prolonged, with multiple stab wounds delivered at close range. This wasn't an act of impulse, it was calculated and methodical. Whoever the killer was, they had stayed in the room for some time, ensuring the victim's death before making any attempt to cover their tracks. The evidence painted a picture that was far from Leon's claim of ignorance. Villagers' testimonies. As the investigation deepened, the police sought insights from the villagers. Many described Leon as a quiet, devoted wife who rarely spoke about her struggles. Yet whispers of tension within the household began to surface. One neighbor recalled muffled arguments late at night, though the words were indistinguishable. Another mentioned seeing Wang Shuang return home with expensive items. luxuries that seemed odd for a family barely making ends meet. The villagers' accounts painted a picture of a home fraught with unspoken conflict, with Leon quietly enduring her hardships. She kept everything bottled up. One elderly villager remarked, "We never thought she could do something like this, but looking back now, maybe it was just too much for her to bear." The community's observations added layers of complexity to the unfolding tragedy, skepticism, and clues. Despite Leon's insistence that she had nothing to do with the crime, the detectives found her demeanor unsettling. She was calm, unnervingly so. Her responses to their questions were measured, almost rehearsed. "She didn't seem like a woman in shock," one detective later remarked. "She looked like someone waiting for the inevitable." The inconsistencies in her story only deepened their suspicions. When asked why she hadn't noticed anything during the night, Leon vaguely claimed to be a heavy sleeper, yet the physical evidence told a different story. The stab wounds were deep and deliberate, requiring both effort and rage. Blood patterns suggested the killer had moved around the room during the attack, leaving no corner untouched. The turning point came when forensic analysis revealed traces of Wang Shuang's blood on a utility knife Leon used for chores, confirming its role in the brutal murder. The moment of truth. The mounting evidence left Leon with little room to maneuver. The burned clothes, the bloodied knife, and the inconsistencies in her story all pointed unmistakably to her guilt. Finally, her calm facade began to crack. During an intense round of questioning, her hands started to tremble, and her once steady gaze faltered. Then, in a voice devoid of emotion, she confessed. "I did it," she said. Her words hung heavy in the room, carrying the weight of a grim truth. Leon recounted the crime in chilling detail, how she had tied Wang Shuang's hands and feet, silenced him with a sock, and stabbed him repeatedly in a fit of unrelenting rage. For the detectives, her confession was both a breakthrough and a haunting insight into a mind pushed beyond its limits. Yet, even with her admission, doubts lingered. Had Leon truly acted alone? How had someone as small as her overpowered a man like Wang Shuang? Twists in the case. The investigation didn't end with Leon's confession. Detectives probed deeper, suspecting she might have had help. Could her parents, who openly disapproved of Wang Shuang's treatment of their daughter, have been involved? However, interviews revealed strong emotions but an airtight alibi. They were working a late shift at a factory the night of the murder. Investigators then explored another possibility, an extramarital affair. Could Leon have had a secret lover who aided her? But exhaustive searches found no evidence. Friends and neighbors described Leon as a woman consumed by the struggles of her home life, leaving little time or space for romantic entanglements. With no evidence of accomplices, the detectives faced a chilling truth. Leon had acted alone. Her overwhelming rage and despair had fueled an act of unimaginable brutality, one that transformed years of silent suffering into a single night of devastating violence. The final reflection. As the investigation concluded, the full weight of Leon's actions came into sharp focus. This wasn't just a murder, it was the story of how love, once pure and strong, had crumbled under the weight of betrayal, neglect, and cruelty. Leon, who had once been a hopeful young woman filled with dreams, had become the face of a crime so savage that it left scars on everyone connected to it. Her confession, though truthful, revealed an unsettling reality. This murder wasn't an impulsive act, but the culmination of years of anguish and simmering hatred. The court proceedings were swift yet emotionally charged. Leon's confession, supported by overwhelming evidence, left no room for doubt. The knives, the burned clothing, and the blood-soaked room painted an undeniable picture of her guilt. The prosecutor spared no detail in describing the crime's brutality. The court heard how Leon had stabbed Wang Shuang repeatedly, with such force that some wounds penetrated deep into his organs. The slashes made after his death were described as acts of unrelenting fury. Leon's defense focused on the years of emotional and physical abuse she had endured. Her lawyer argued that her actions were the result of a desperate, broken mind pushed beyond its limits. The court faced a complex decision. While Leon's crime was calculated and heinous, the suffering she endured was undeniable. In the end, justice was served. Leon was sentenced to life imprisonment. The case stood as a grim reminder of how love, when betrayed, could lead to unimaginable tragedy, a tragedy beyond repair. The aftermath of the case left a profound and lasting impact on the community. For Wang Shuang's family, the loss was devastating. His parents, who had pinned their hopes and dreams on their son's future, were left grieving not only for his death, but for the life he would never live. His younger brother, consumed by anger and bitterness, insisted that Leon had twisted the truth to justify her monstrous actions. For Leon's family, the pain was no less excruciating. Her elderly parents, who had supported her through every struggle, were now left grappling with the knowledge that their daughter had committed such a brutal crime. They had spent years trying to keep the family intact, only to see it reduced to nothing but devastation. At the heart of it all was their child, too young to understand the gravity of what had happened. Orphaned by his parents' choices, he became the silent victim of this tragedy, destined to grow up haunted by the legacy of a crime that had irreparably torn his world apart. A cautionary tale. Leon's story stands as a haunting reminder of the destructive power of unchecked pain and despair. It revealed how love, when betrayed, could twist into hatred so consuming that it destroyed everything in its path. The villagers, shaken by the savagery of the murder, often spoke of the tragedy as a cautionary tale. It served as a stark reminder of how neglect, cruelty, and the erosion of trust could transform even the strongest of relationships into a battlefield. They whispered about how years of silent suffering could erupt into unimaginable violence, leaving scars not only on those involved, but on the entire community. For the police, it was a case that would never fade from memory, a chilling example of the depths human desperation could reach. It reminded them that tragedy rarely begins with a single moment, but is often the result of pain and resentment left to fester over time. The legacy of a nightmare. Leon now lives behind bars, spending her days in the shadow of the crime that has defined her. The blood she spilled that night is a stain she will carry for the rest of her life. Wang Shuang, once the man she loved, is remembered not for the life he lived, but for the horrific way it ended. This was far more than a murder. It was the unraveling of a family, the shattering of a community, and a story that continues to echo in the hearts of all who hear it. In the end, no one emerged unscathed. Not Leon, not Wang Shuang, not their families. What began as love ended in unimaginable tragedy, showing how far the human heart can fall when pushed to its limits. If this story gripped you, there's more where it came from. Subscribe to our channel for more chilling tales of crime, betrayal, and the darkest corners of the human mind. Don't miss a single story. Hit that subscribe button now.